Welcome to this tutorial in which we're going to build a page builder with the Froala rich text editor. So if you want to know how Wix or Squarespace, how they're building these page builders, I will show you how they do it in this video. It's actually very straightforward. Or maybe you're looking for a rich text editor to use in your React app or any kind of app, and I'll show you exactly why you may want to use Froala. Maybe you're already using Froala and you just want to see how to set it up, how to get it working with React and Next.js specifically, how to make it work with TypeScript, and how you can configure certain settings. That's exactly what I will show you in this video as well. Right, so this video will show you how Froala works, and they are also the sponsor of this video. So let me quickly show you the demo of what we're going to build in this video. So we're going to have some kind of UI like this. And what I can do here is I can add these, elements to the page, right? So imagine you have some kind of software and you allow your users to build their own pages. Right, so I should be able to add a heading. And when I click on there, you can see that I get this Froala text editor. So Froala is the tool that will make all of this work, but let me show you how this works. So this would be, let's say, our heading of the page. So I could say something like, maybe we're building a website for booking your hot air balloons. Book your hot air balloon. I can select this, and now with this rich text editor from Froala, I can change the design here. So maybe I want to make it 36 in size, and I can make it bold or italic, underscore, right? So I have this toolbar that Froala gives me. I can also determine what this should become in the HTML. So I want this to become an H1. I have the background color, emojis, right? So I can do all of this customization. I can change the color if I want, right? So I have all of these customizations here because of this toolbar. We'll talk all about this. This doesn't really look like a normal page where we have this UI here. So what I can do is I can make this toolbar inline, as it's called. We'll talk all about that. I just quickly want to give you an example. And now when I do that, you can see that that UI from that editor is gone. But if I click on this, we still get that toolbar. So we can still change things. Maybe I want to change the color here, let's say. I want to make this a red color. Now it's a red color. I'm going to Control Z there, right? So with the Froala text editor, these are basically the two main ways that you're going to use it. You're going to have that standard editor look, or you want to have this inline look. And then what I can do here is, for example, I can center it. So here I have align. I can say align this in the center, right? And I also have this character plugin actually that Froala gives me, which shows how many characters I have left. Right, so we'll talk all about the plugins that Froala gives us. For now, let's say I don't want to have that. I can just set it to false, and now that's gone. All right, now I do want to add a little bit more space here. So what I can do is I can just increase the line height like this. And then I want to continue with the rest of my page. So now I want to add an image, let's say. Right, so I'm going to show you how to build this page builder. Maybe you've wondered how Wix and Squarespace and these other companies, how they do that. How do you build something like that? Well, it's actually quite straightforward. But basically what I'm doing is every time I click on any of these tools here, I instantiate a new instance of that Froala text editor. So with Froala, you can also add your own image. So what I can do here is I can replace this default one where we say click me. I can actually use one of the built-in ones that Froala gives me. So let's say I want to have this hot air balloon, and I can actually increase this. So maybe I want this to be full width, or maybe just center aligned as well, maybe a little bit smaller, right? So I can resize it like that. And then maybe below that, we want to have paragraph text. So now I click on text here. I'm going to get another instance of the Froala text editor. Right, so here, if I comment out this toolbar inline setting, you can see that what I get here is another instance of that editor. Right, so you can see now all of them have that default UI again. Right, so maybe that's all you need, but maybe you're building a page builder like we're doing here, or maybe some kind of email builder. You allow your users to build like an email. In that case, you're going to have multiple different content blocks. And for each content block, you may want to have a separate instance. Right, so here I'm going to add the toolbar inline back again, because what we want to get here is, we want to see what we actually get as a result immediately as we type here. And then when we click here, we see our Froala options here. Now Froala gives you this quick insert as well. So if you quickly want to insert a video or a table or unordered or ordered list, even a horizontal line, very easy to do, right? So here I can add a table. I can configure it exactly as I want this table to be. You can see all the settings that you get by default if you use the Froala editor. Right, let me remove that. Let me actually instantiate another one here. So here maybe I want to add some text. I want to add it to the center here, and I just want to add something like hot air balloons are only available on sunny days. right? And then I can style it how I want it because I added all of these buttons to the toolbar. Right, so the toolbar is the most important part, I would say, about this editor instance, and you can customize it exactly as you want. And if you look closely, you can see that for the text, it is actually already a little bit differently than for the heading. Right, so for the heading, we have fewer options. For the text, well, we may want to have, well, basically any option. Right, so here, for example, the text, I can click on more text, which showcases all of the text options I have. The font size should maybe be a little bit bigger. Let's make it 24. And let's change the color here. Maybe I want to change the color to some other color like this. Now you can see it's this purple color, right? All of these buttons you can configure, right? Maybe more paragraph, right? Maybe here, for example, we can add a border actually, right? So all of these options are available to us. We can even use markdown here if you also use the plugin, right? So I will also show you how to add these plugins to Froala. I'll show you how to set up everything, right? I can do all of that here as well. And then I have some other content blocks that a user can add as well. Maybe a button. You can also do that with Froala. So here you can just click on the button. I can configure the text. So here we can say book now. Right, let's do that. And then update, and it updates. Right, so let me remove this. We also have a link. Right, so here for link text, we can also do that with Froala. Right, so Froala has the basic component for your editors, but if you want to insert a button or a link or an image, right, for these three, Froala actually offers you some special components. So here for link, I can change the link style. I can edit the link text here as well if I want. Let me remove that for now. And let me actually refresh here because I want to show you the other two as well, not at the bottom here. So we also have a code block here. So maybe, for example, you want to allow the user to write in code. Maybe they can copy and paste certain snippets of code. Right, so here, for example, I may want to say, welcome to my page. And the user should be able to write that in code. So then here they can write it in HTML code, and then we can click on this, and it will actually output that as the h1 here in the HTML. And then there's also markdown. So if I click on markdown here, we can also do markdown here. So here I can say welcome in markdown format, and it will actually output the result here on the right side. I can also make this smaller or bigger. Froala is a really powerful what you see is what you get HTML editor. I'll show you exactly how to set it up with Next.js. I'll also mention some tips for Vite and how to make it work with TypeScript, and generally speaking, how to work with it. Right, so we're going to look at how to set it up in React, but it also works for Vue or these other frameworks. And then I'll show you how to work with their events, right? So as the user is typing something or they do something, there are events that we can hook into. And there are also methods. So in these events, we get access to the editor instance, and on that editor instance, you can call these methods. Right, we also have options. So when you add one of those editors to the page, you can, well, configure all the options that you see here. Now, we're not going to talk about all of the options, but I'll show you the most important ones, the most common things that you want to do, right? So a lot of these options, sometimes these options need plugins. Like for example, for the character counter, that doesn't work out of the box because Froala tries to be lean by default. So if you want to use a special functionality like a character counter, you just have to add a plugin, but it's super easy. So you just have to include, well, the CSS and the JS file for that particular plugin, and it will automatically be applied to your editor instance. All right, now they show you on the website how to install it for React. So let's actually get started and try recreating what we see here. All right, so I just created a new Next.js project and I removed all of the boilerplate. So currently we have an empty page. And let's quickly recreate the UI of the example here. So we're gonna have, well, basically two parts here. So the left side here is gonna be the actual editing area. So on the right side, we're gonna have our own toolbar, right? So just a set of tools. We're gonna have 7 here. And if we click on any of them, we wanna be able to insert that here in what we will call the editing area. So we have an editing area and we have the toolbar. So how can we get that layout here? So I'm going to use Flexbox. You want to use a Flexbox in the vast majority of the time when you're creating layouts. CSS Grid is maybe 2% of the time in my experience. So we have those two parts, right? So I will create a div for the left side and then a div for the toolbar side. So the left side is just going to be the rest of the page. So for the toolbar here, what we can do is we can give it a width of 390 pixels. I will give it a background color, and actually I will also add a height here. So in Flexbox, if you have these are two flex items. So here we can give this a width, and then we can say this other one should just take up everything else. So you do that with flex 1. So this is the layout that we want. Let me make it a little bit wider. Right, so this is similar to what we want. Let me quickly add some base classes here to the layout as well. We'll just make this entire the height of everything the same as the viewport, and I will just add a background color for everything. All right, so then here we're gonna have the editing area. We'll create a separate component for that. And then here we're gonna have our own toolbar, right? So this is, you have a toolbar in the Froala text editor, but here we're gonna have the toolbar for the app. All right, I will quickly create a separate folder for them. I will call that editing area and toolbar. All right, so now I just imported the editing area, and I've given this a width and height with a white background color as well as a border, right? So that's what we're gonna see here. This is the actual canvas, you could say. Okay, so then for the toolbar, all right, so then I'm gonna import the toolbar. I just created the toolbar here. So the toolbar here has a set of tools. So the toolbar here is also just a section here. I've given it a background color, and it's mapping over the tools, right? So here we have 7 tools in the toolbar. So I'm going to represent each one by an object. So here I have created just an array. This is the React way of doing it. You create an array and then you map over them. So here we're gonna have one for the heading, right? So here heading, and they're also each gonna have an icon. So here we also have an icon. I'm actually using Radix UI icons. So let me quickly install that as well. Okay, quickly install that. Okay, so now you can see when I go back, I have my tools here. Right, so here I just have 7 objects in the array. So we have a name and an icon for each one. And that's what we're mapping over here, right? So tools that map. For each tool, we're going to create a button. So all of them are buttons. They have some styling. And then here we use the icon. And then here we have the name, right? So that's how this UI is created. Let me also center this white area here. We can do that with Flexbox as well. Right, so let me just do this. And now this is centered as well. All right, I just changed the height to 800 here. All right, so then we have this, and now we have the UI that we want, right? So this looks the same as here, right? So just to give an overview here, so we have on the home page here right now, we have this editing area. That's actually this white space that you see here. And then we have our own toolbar, and that's gonna be all of these tools here. All right, now let's try making this work. So if we click heading, let's say, we wanna get a Froala editor here in this editing area. So let's actually try adding a Froala editor even without clicking. Let's just try adding one here to the editing area in here in the section here. Let's just try adding Froala to our React or Next.js, I should say, project. So they actually have a nice guide here to install here, but there are some rough edges, and I'll show you how to smooth them out. Right, so Froala itself is just a JavaScript editor, but they have React bindings. But we're gonna install the Froala editor itself and then also these React bindings. So I'm gonna install Froala editor. Let's quickly open up a terminal here. So I'm gonna say npm install the Froala editor itself and then also the React bindings. So we have React Froala, and then it's what you see is what you get. Right, so YCWIG. Right, so these are the two that we need, but then also in the toolbar of Froala, they use Font Awesome for the icons. So we're also gonna install Font Awesome here. So I'm gonna install Font Awesome as well. All right, so these are the 3 things that we're gonna need. So I'm gonna install them right now. All right, so now we installed those 3 tools. Let me close this. All right, so let's see what else they recommend that we do. So now we need to import some files here. So here we need to add the CSS, and then we have the actual Froala editor component. So let's actually copy these 3 lines. So I'm gonna copy these 3 lines. Right, and you can find this page by just Googling Froala React. Let's see if I manage to copy this. Yeah, so now I copy these 3 lines. So let me just add that here to the editing area here. I'm just gonna paste them right here. Okay, so the bundler will now pick up these CSS files, and now we can also use the Froala editor component. So now we can just try adding this to our page here. Right, so now you may think we can just do this. Now by default, I actually get a suggestion here from Copilot, but when you instantiate a new editor instance, you can say with which tag it should be instantiated with. right? So this is going to be some kind of input component. Now, if you have one line of input in HTML, you can use the input tag. If you have multiple lines, it's typically recommended that you use a text area. Right, so for this editor component, typically you're going to have multiple lines, of course. So let's actually instantiate it with a text area tag. All right, so here they show you that you could add a div with editor if you do it like this. However, for us, that's not going to be necessary. All right, so then we can pass some options and some other things to configure that instance. But before we get there, let's actually just see if this works. So now if we go here in the editing area, we should see a Froala editor instance. So let's see what we get. And what you're going to get is error window is not defined. Because this Froala editor component under the hood is using, well, the window object. And the window object is not available on the server. Right, so remember, we are using Next.js here, and by default in the app directory, everything is a server component. So this will run on the server. And so then when we use this, well, this is going to use the window object under the hood, and there is no window on the server, right? There's a window here in the browser on the client. Now you may think, well, we can just turn this into a client component, right? So we can say use client. If you do this, well, I found that sometimes this actually helps. But it's not going to be the right solution because even client components run on the server, right? So for example, when Next.js renders your route, it may statically generate the whole route. It's just going to create HTML during the build of that route, which means that even client components, they are run on the server at least once, right? So server components only run on the server, and client components run in the client, but also at least once on the server when they are pre-generated, right? So it's really confusing in Next.js with the server and client components, but the point being is that even a client component can run on the server, and therefore right now actually it happens to work, but often, and maybe we will see that later if I would continue like this will still give you errors. So this is not a recommended way of importing it. So how do you make sure that you only import this component on the client and that it doesn't run on the server? Well, there is basically only one way of doing that in Next.js, and that's not by importing it like this, but it's by using a dynamic import as it's called. So we have dynamic here from Next dynamic, and you can see I actually already get a great suggestion here from Copilot. So you have two arguments here. So the first one is a function, and in that function, we run that import statement. So here we want to run import React Froala, what you see is what you get. And then the second argument here is you can say, should this be server-side rendered? This is important that you also add this here. And we can say, no, we don't want this to be server-side rendered. So when you do this, this will only be imported on the client. It will never run on the server. And so this can access the window object or whatever it needs to do perfectly fine without us getting errors. So this is the recommended way that you import the Froala editor component, right? So then what you get from dynamic here, we can assign that to Froala editor component. We can call it whatever we want, but it makes sense that we call it like this, right? And that's the component that you can then use here, right? So so you can still use it the same way. It's just that you import it essentially a little bit differently, right? So if you do this and save and refresh, you'll see that it still all works the same. But now you shouldn't get any errors with the window object. If you do it like this, sometimes it works, I found, but sometimes after some time you get some strange error, and it's because you're importing it like this. All right, so now we have this, and now we have the Froala text editor here on the page. Let me zoom out a little bit, right? So this is what we see in the UI. Now I'm gonna zoom in a little bit so you can see better what I'm doing here. All right, let me actually make it quite big here. So here we now have our text editor. You can see by default it spans the entire width. We can customize everything here essentially, but I can type whatever I want, test. I can select this. Here we have some options here, right? So by default, these are the buttons that you get. You don't get every button. So here, for example, now I cannot change the font size. So here I can make it bold, italic, etc. These are basic options. But what if I want to increase the font size, let's say? Right, so now we want to add a button here to this toolbar of Froala, right? So we have our own toolbar here, but this is the toolbar in the Froala editor. How do you customize that? So now you want to use the config prop here. So here we have the tag prop, but you also get the config prop, and here is where you can pass all of the options. It's going to be an object. Here you can pass all of the options to the Froala component. So they actually show you all of the options here. Let me show that to docs. in docs. So here in docs, we can go to concepts. Yeah, so then here in the sidebar on the left side, we have APIs. So we have events. So there's going to be events we can hook into that. There are methods that we can use on the editor instance, but then we also have options here. These are all the options that you can pass to that component. So for example, here we have an option for the font size, right? So you can just click on there and let's go there. And here we can see that we can pass an array with all the options that the user should have for font size. Now here, importantly, it will also show you for all of those options if you need a plugin, right? So by default, we cannot just add font size option here because Froala is very lean, which is great for performance. But then if you do want to have additional features like a font size, you do need to include a plugin. So for example, let's try adding this. So here I want to be able to do the following. So here in the config, I want to be able to say font size. Well, that's going to be an array with all of those font sizes that the user should get. So I'm going to copy all of these actually, and I'm going to save here. Right, so now we have, and let's actually make it a little cleaner here. Let's make it 48 at most, and at least 12. So if we just have this as the array, and now if I go back, you can see nothing changed here because I have not included the plugin to make that work. So the plugin, very importantly, also needs to be imported the same way as here. So for example, we can use another dynamic here if we want. And remember, it always is a function initially. And then the second option here is an object. And here we can say SSR is false. Okay, so then here in the function, you can do the import, right? So here I can actually do it on one line. So I can remove the curly braces. So here what we want to import is that plugin. So in the left side of that, so in the sidebar here of the docs here, they also show you all of the plugins that are available. So here we have the align, character counter, but what we're interested in is the font size. So if I click on font size here, they should show you the URL for importing it. All right, so here they show you how to import this. So you can actually use a CDN, but we already installed Froala in Node modules, and the plugins come as part of that. So it's actually this path that we want. So without the ... if we just use that path, and then it's in that Froala editor package, right? So not the React bindings, but just the core of Froala. The package is called Froala editor, and then it's that path. Okay, so if I save here, and now we go back, and let me refresh here, then we actually still don't see the option here, because if you want to add more buttons to the toolbar, that's another setting that you need to specify. So here, if we go to options once again, we also have toolbar buttons, and they actually allow you to specify this per breakpoint. So by default, this is actually responsive. So if you make it less wide, you can see that it actually changes. You can specify that for each breakpoint, which buttons you want. Now here for toolbar buttons, I just want to have this font size for all of the breakpoints. Right, so here for toolbar buttons, this is an important one because this is how you can configure all of the buttons that you see in the toolbar. So for example, what we can say here is toolbar buttons. So you can do this as an object or as an array. So let's actually do an array here, and we can call that font size. Right, so this is an option. So in React here, you specify all of those options here for the config prop here. So here, let's actually, and not as a prop on the component, but as part of this config object. So here, toolbar buttons. So this can be an object itself, or it can be an array. So we can have an array here, and then we can say font size. All right, so now if I save here and go back. All right, so if we do this and now go here, if I just refresh for a clean slate, well, we can see, we don't see any font size button here. If I click on more text, I also don't see a button for the font size, right? So this, for some reason, is not working. So we actually need to change the imports here because we have two dynamic imports here, and it works if you do it with just one dynamic import. So let's actually do that. Let me actually remove this comment as well from before, just for cleaning up. So how can we combine this into one dynamic import? Well, remember this dynamic here, the first part is just a function. So we can open up the function here. So we can just open up the function here. Right, so we can just open this up. And here now, let's see. So here what we want to do is we want to still do this import. So I can just, whatever the result of that is, I'm going to call it result. And that's still what we want to return from that function, right? But then what we also want to do is we want to import this one. So we also want to import this plugin. We don't need to assign the plugin import to anything. We just need to import it and it will automatically be applied to our project. All right, so admittedly the syntax here is a bit strange or unfamiliar, but one more thing we want to do here is we want to make this async await. So typically what people do here, what you can do is you can make this async and then you can await these two imports. Now, if you do it like this, you're first going to wait for this import and then you're going to await for this import. But we want it to be in parallel. We want this to load as fast as possible. So what you can do here actually, we can do promise.all. So here you can pass all the promises and it will just turn and will convert it into one promise that we can then await. Right, so this needs to be an array of all of the promises that we want to do in parallel. So here that's going to be this one, comma, and then all of the plugins that we want. Right, so in this case, we're just going to have one plugin for now, and then we can remove this. All right, so so then in the result, we actually get we will actually get an object here. Now what we need to return is this component here because that's what we're assigning here. So in that result, we want to get the first one. Right, so a little bit of setup here, but now if you do this, and now let me just refresh here for a clean slate. Now we have these buttons. If I open this one up, you can see we now have 5 here, including our font size here. So let me make this a little bit bigger again. Right, so here we now have font size, we have our options here. Right, so now if I have test, I can select this and I can increase this to 48. Okay, so a little bit of setup here, but it's working now. Now we have all of these other buttons as well, but you can notice, for example, we don't have text color, right? So I don't have anything for the text color here. And one other one that we typically also want here is alignment. So maybe I want to put this in the center, for example. So those are actually also plugins. So if you scroll down here, we just saw all of these toolbar buttons. Froala mentions here that a lot of those buttons, they need a specific plugin. So for alignment, for example, you need the align plugin. For color, you need a colors plugin, right? So for a lot of those buttons, you need a special plugin. So here on the website, you can see all of the plugins that they have. Let me go back to that overview. So here in the sidebar, you can see all of those plugins. Yeah, so here you have align, you have character counter, you have all of these plugins, color, right? Now we could install them all one by one, and that would be best for performance, right? So then you get a very lean editor because you only have the things that you're actually going to use. Now for this tutorial, I will just import all of them so that we're not constantly struggling with the individual plugins. So I will just comment this out and I will just say, this is one plugin, right? Now you can also just import all of them in one go. And that's with this path here. So we still have Froala editor and then JS. And then it's this plugins.package.minified version, right? So if you do this one, if you now save, and now if we go here, and refresh here, you can see we have a bunch more buttons here under more text, right? So including the text color, we already had font size. We also have font family. We have all of these additional buttons now. Right? But of course, this is worse for performance because now we're importing all of the code, even though we may not use some of these plugins, right? So that's a trade-off that you can make. All right, so let me go down here because I have a bunch of buttons here that we don't really want. So strike through, I want to remove this subscript and superscript, let's remove that as well. Inline class, this clear formatting perhaps is useful. Background color, let's also remove that. So let's just remove a bunch of them. So here I specified the toolbar buttons with an object and then with more text. So these buttons are going to be here under more text. So if I refresh, you can see we have these buttons now under more text. What if you don't want them under more text? Right, they shouldn't be hidden away. They should just be here in the toolbar. Well, then you wouldn't use an object for the toolbar buttons. You can also just have an array for the toolbar buttons. So if I have toolbar buttons, it can also be an array. Right, so here I can just specify those buttons here in the toolbar buttons and then remove this. Right, so now let me change this as well. All right, let me add a comma here. So now we have all of those buttons in an array. So let me refresh here. Yeah, so now you can see they are present here in the toolbar without being hidden away. Right, so that's an important way of customizing the toolbar here. All right, so let me go back to the object syntax one more time. So this is what I have right now. This is what it looks like here in the browser. Now, one other thing you can do here to customize this is you can also have these separators. So for example, between bold and italic, so here the first three here are going to be displayed. And then actually, let's say between these three and here this more button, maybe we want to have some kind of separator between them. So what you can actually do, so it needs to be one more here. So here in between them, so here after the underline, we can then have the pipe symbol. If you add the pipe symbol here, if I save here, you can see there's now a separator here. And maybe you even want everything to go on the next row, let's say. So what you can also do, instead of a pipe symbol, you can actually do a dash like this. If I save here, you can see it actually moves the other part down here. Right? So you can also change the layout of these buttons in the toolbar. And it also works here. So here, if I open up the more text here you can also add a dash here, let's say. If I save here, right? So that's maybe something you want to do as well. But I will go back to the array syntax. Right? So that's maybe also something you want to do here. But I will leave off these separators for now. Now it's good to mention that Froala also allows you to add custom buttons to the toolbar. So here, for example, they give you an example on their website where they have a hello and some trash can icon here. Right, so if you Google for Froala custom button, they will show you exactly how to do that. It's outside the scope of this tutorial, but it is possible. All right, so next thing I want to talk about the TypeScript setup with Froala. So by default, the Froala editor component, let's say I make a mistake. Maybe I think there is some prop called toolbar buttons. Right, so I actually think that there is a prop name for toolbar buttons, but it should of course be specified in config, but I don't know that. Maybe I think it's a prop on the component itself. You can see TypeScript actually properly warns me and tells me there is no toolbar buttons prop on this component. Right, so I can fix my mistake. But what if I try to add something here to the config that does not exist? Maybe I think there is more text here as the name of some key here. Right, so maybe more text, of course, is part of toolbar buttons, but maybe I think it's part of the config object here. So now if I try to do this, I don't get any warning. I don't see any red squiggly line. So I'm making a mistake here, and I can make it even more egregious. I can say blah, 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 and I don't get any warning here. So why is TypeScript not helping me out here? So let's actually see how we can improve the TypeScript setup here. So let's see, if we scroll up, we actually have a red squiggly line. So maybe there is a TypeScript issue here. And indeed, there seems to be a TypeScript issue. So it cannot find a declaration file for module blah, blah, blah. So what we could try is, well, with third parties, what you want to try sometimes is you want to see if their types are in that @types repository, which is basically a huge repository that the community has created with all sorts of types for all sorts of for all sorts of packages. So you can use TypeScript for a lot of packages, right? So sometimes you just want to try and see if they are created there. So we can just try installing that. You can see it's not in the registry, so that doesn't help out. So that doesn't work. Now what we may want to do is you just want to open up the node modules and you want to see if they actually have types there. So I'm going to open up the node modules here. And I'm going to search for Froala editor. So here I can see Froala editor, and then I see index.d.ts. So I'm going to open that file up. So here we may want to look for, well, what issue did we have here again? Let's see, editing area. The issue here was for the config object. Why? Let's see if there's actually proper typing for that, because we're going to work a lot with this config prop here. Because this is how you pass all of the options that you can pass in Froala in React, right? So we do want to have type safety here. So maybe there is something here that we can work with. Now here, there's a lot of things here. Maybe I should just search for options, right? So in Froala, it's called the Froala options. In React, in the React bindings, we use the config prop, but these are actually the Froala options. And here you can see there is actually an interface here for the Froala options, which shows all of the options that you can pass to the config prop. So this is of course what we want to apply here. So why is this not applied? Well, let's actually scroll down a little bit. So if we scroll all the way down, let's see. If we scroll all the way down, you can see at the bottom of that interface, they have this general, basically any key with an any here. So if we save here, and now I try to add something in this config object that shouldn't be here, you still will not get a warning. So here, for example, I can still add some blah blah and I don't get a warning, but we should get a warning. So why is this not being applied? Well, this is actually just the core of Froala. So one way to make this work is, for example, we could specify the config outside the component here. And that's actually typically what you do want to do because we don't want to clutter up the JSX here. We could say something like Froala config, and we can specify that object right here. So let's actually quickly do that. I'm going to copy this object here and cut it away from here. And I will just paste that right here. I'm going to save here. And then I can pass the Froala config to the config prop, right? So now it's a bit cleaner. Now it's nicely separated, so we can just focus on the config here. Now what we can do here is we can type this object as that type that we have here. So this is called, well, what's this interface called? Let's see. The Froala options interface. So Froala options, and my autocomplete actually gives me the suggestion to import that. So it's actually imported here from Froala editor. We can actually just import that. And when you do that, you will actually get a warning if you make a mistake, right? Which is what we want. We should get warnings if we make mistakes. So this is one way of applying the Froala options. So now I can fix my mistake and we are good to go. Now, of course, there's one problem here, because now if you do it this way, we're saying it should have all of those properties, right? So all of the things, API key, app, it should all be in there. And right now we only have toolbar buttons and font size. So we can use the partial utility here in TypeScript to indicate, to say that it doesn't have to all be in there, just part of it, just partially. Right, so if you do that, we now have type safety with Froala for the config. And again, the config is important because this is where you're going to spend a lot of your time when you work with Froala. So I thought I should show you how to set this up with TypeScript. Right, so here we can now close out of that file. All right, so now we've talked about the options that you can pass to your Froala editor component. That's one major part of Froala. The other two major parts of Froala that you need to know about, right? So for part one was the options. That's what we looked at now. So the other two things, let's scroll up here. So here on the left side, you have APIs. So we saw options, but then there are also events and methods. So let's go to events and methods. Let me open the other one up in a new tab. Let me close the plugins here. So events are things that happen that we can hook into. So for example, right now we have this character counter here in our editor here. And this is because we are importing all plugins, right? So here we are importing all plugins. And as soon as you import a plugin, it's automatically applied. So one of those plugins is actually that character counter, right? And therefore it's automatically added to our editor here. Right, so that's why we have a character counter now. So if I type, you can see it keeps track of how many characters I've written. Now, whenever this character counter updates, there is actually an event. So here you can see under events, there is a character counter.update event and also an exceeded event. So if we click on the update one, it will scroll me down here. Let's see. So here I can hook into that with events. So how do you do that here in React? Well, events is also part of this config object, right? So it's actually just part of the options. And you can see now, thanks to IntelliSense here from TypeScript, I can see that there is indeed events here. And then here you can specify, well, character counter update. So we can, let me just copy this example. So character counter.update. Now what you get here is also an instance of the editor. So here you get that in the this keyword. So here what you can do, for example, is then use a method. So the methods are the functions that you can use on that editor instance. So here, for example, I see a method for character counter.count. If I click on that one, you can see that you can call that on the editor instance and it will give you the count. So if I want to know how many characters this user has written, what we can do here is we can use this dot character counter, and then it's the count method. So here, let's actually try this out. So now every time this updates, we should see the count in the console log. And actually I get an error if I do that, and it says count is not defined. Okay, so initially it says cannot read properties of undefined, so character counter can be undefined initially. So we will just do some optional chaining here. It will just give us undefined if it's not defined, that's okay. All right, so now if I open up the console log, so let me refresh here for a clean slate. So now if I type here, you can see we get access to the number of characters the user has written. Right, so this shows you that there are events, there are many events that we can hook into. You specify it like this. Now here it's a string because, well, as an object key, you typically don't have a dot like, if you want to have a dot like this, well, you need to put it in quotes like this. And then we have a function here. Now, importantly, this should not be an arrow function. So that's one of the main differences actually that a lot of people don't know about, but in JavaScript, if you do an arrow function, this keyword does not bind properly. And so this keyword works differently in the traditional function syntax versus the arrow function syntax. So here with the traditional function, this keyword works as expected here. Right, so make sure you use the traditional function syntax. And then, so that's an event, right? So that's the callback here for when that event occurs. And then in there, you get access to the editor instance with the this keyword, and on there you can call all of these methods, right? So all of these methods are available on that editor instance, and I will show you some other common ones as we build out that demo project, right? So events here, if I scroll up a bit, these are all the events that you can hook into, right? And those are essentially the three things that you really need to know about Froala. So we saw how to set it up. Then we saw how to pass the options. Now we see how to hook into those events. And when you have an event, you can also use methods on that editor instance. Now, a more realistic example here would not be to use character counter update. What we may want to do is set a maximum number of characters that the user can type. So we can actually pass that as an option here as well. So let's see, let's just add that here. So we can say character counter. There are actually two options here. So we have character counter max, and there's also character counter, we can set it to false, right? So remember, if you import one of those plugins, it's automatically applied. But what if you have some component instance, because we're gonna have multiple, and you don't wanna have that character counter? Well, you can also opt out of it like this. But what could be interesting here is for a heading, and let's say for a heading, we don't wanna have a very large heading. So we want to prevent the user from having those massive headings. So maybe at most the user can type 50. And actually for this demo, let's make it 5. So then if the user reaches that threshold, there will actually be an event that we can then hook into again. And that's the character counter.exceeded event. And we'll have another function here. And here what we may want to do is something like an alert. You have exceeded the maximum number of characters. And actually, let's make it a little bit more contextual to the demo project here. We could say you have hit the limit for a heading. Consider using a text block for more content, right? Because we're also going to have this text block. All right. So now if I save here, and now you can see now also it shows 5 as the maximum here. If I now reach that threshold, I get this alert. Right, so that is how Froala works in a nutshell. Okay, but let's actually change this to a more realistic number. Let's make it 50, let's say. And now I want to show you that what you may want to do is, instead of having this toolbar always present and also this footer here, basically the UI of the editor, maybe that's not what you want. So if you're building some kind of page builder like we're doing here, maybe some kind of email builder, and you really need to have that, well, literally what you see is what you get, you may want to have the following options. So what you can also do is you can say toolbar inline. You can set that to true, and then it will be gone. So now if we go back, you can see that our UI, that editor, the toolbar, everything is gone. Now we still see the characters here, but where is the toolbar now? Well, now if you try to type something, well, you get the quick insert still, right? So this, by the way, is also, let me zoom out a little bit. Right, so this quick insert is also automatically applied here because it's a plugin, and we're importing all the plugins. So all the plugins by default are applied here. So I will keep that here, but where is our normal toolbar? So if I try to type now, and now you click or select everything, you can see that we get our toolbar back, right? But now this is now floating over our text here. And this is actually pretty slick, right? For a lot of use cases, like our use case here, this is what we want. Because now, if I change something here, if I change, let's say, the font size to 36, this is actually what I would see on the page, right? So I'm building a page here as a user. I'm trying to build a page, and I want to see what it's actually going to look like. So this is what I would want to see. Now we don't want to see the characters in that case either. So let's actually disable that here. So what we can say is char counter count. Let's actually set it to false. So now you can see that's gone as well. And now we have, all right, so right now we have this one editor instance on the page, right? So, all right, so right now, if I type here and I select it, we see the toolbar, but maybe I already want to see the toolbar if we just click here. So there is another option for that called toolbar visible without selection, right? So all of these options, you can go to the Froala website. They show you all of the options that you can add. So I'm going to save here. And now when I hover or when I just click it, you can see I haven't selected anything, but I still see the toolbar. All right, so this also works. A really nice way of adding a header here to the page. So now let's actually build out our functionality here a little bit better. So we're going to add a heading, text, image. Let's see how we can add all of that. All right, so let me remove this. So let's imagine that this one is for the heading. So if we click on heading here, we want to be able to see this. Now here we see type something. Now that's a placeholder text, and maybe we can make it a little bit more interesting. So if we look at the example, you can see the heading actually has some other placeholder text here. So it has your heading, and also it's styled a little bit differently. So for the placeholder text, we have placeholder text. Right, so here type something, but what we want is probably something like your heading. All right, so if I save here, and now you can see the placeholder text is your heading. All right, so we'll deal with the styling here later. Now let's just try and see if we can make it work so that when we click on any of these buttons, that it actually inserts that content block in this editing area. Right, so if we take a look at our editing area right now, if we just look at what we're actually rendering here, it's just one Froala editor component. Now in the real world, if you're building a page builder or an email builder, there are some use cases where you actually want multiple of these components or editor components on the page. Right, that's also what we're going to have here. So what we want actually is, what we want to have is, let's say, an array of content blocks that should be on the page here. So we can call it content blocks. I'm going to call it content blocks. It's going to be an array. And then what we could have, for example, maybe we have one for a heading, right? So we just have a string here, let's say, and then we have one for text. And maybe the user also adds an image, right? So let's just start here. So here we have, let's say that there should be 3 content blocks here in the editing area. So what we can do is we can have this array here, and we can just map over that. And for each element in the array, we can just, well, instantiate another Froala editor component. So here I can say content blocks.map. So over each block, return a, let's see, return something. Okay, now what we want to return maybe is this Froala editor component. Okay, so I'm just going to paste that right here. Okay, so now for each block here in the array, we are going to add this Froala editor component. It has the same config for all of them. So now if we go back, you can see we have 3 your headings here, and they are now all working the same way, right? So you can instantiate multiple Froala editor components on the page, right? And we don't see the toolbars only if we click on there, but again, you can change all of that, right? So here, if I comment this out from the toolbar inline, you will see that we now have these three Froala editor components. Now, Froala recommends that if you have multiple on the page, that you also add the following option, which is initOnClick. So if you have multiple, it's quite heavy on the page. So if you specify this option, it will reduce the page load time. So it will only initialize the editor if you actually click. So if I save here, right, so now we don't see the UI anymore, right? Even though this is commented out, right? So we expect to see the UI right now, but we don't. But if I click here, you can see it's loaded properly, right? So this is maybe an optimization that you want to make. And actually, since we are using the toolbar inline, it actually is a good idea to use it together because it doesn't hinder it doesn't really hinder anyway, right? So here we don't see the UI here, but that's not what we want to see anyway, right? So we'll keep toolbar inline and the other option also applied. So now we have this, right? So it's initialized when we click on that, and that is actually perfectly fine for our use case here. So it's a nice optimization, especially if you have that inline toolbar. All right, now before we actually add something to that array, right? So what we're going to do is when we click on that, we're going to make sure that we actually add something to this content blocks array, right? So right now we just have this static array, and we are always returning this Froala editor component with always the same config. Now you can imagine that if we have a heading, we may want to have slightly different options than if we have text or an image. So what we want here is that for each of them, they also should have a different config. So instead of calling this Froala config, maybe we can just call that config, and then let's call that heading, right? So now I'm going to collapse this here so we have some space. So now if it's mapping over heading here, we want to make sure that we pass the config heading variable as the config. Now, if you try making this a template literal, it actually won't work, right? So it's quite appealing here to try doing something like this, where you have config and then we use block. This will actually just become a string. So it will be something like config heading. Right? So we're just going to assign a string to config here, but we actually want to use the variable. So it's probably a bit cleaner here to use a switch statement, right? So what we can do here is we can just switch over the block, and we can do, well, let's see if Copilot helps me out. So if we're mapping over heading, we're gonna pass the heading. So let me remove that as the config, right? And let's see if Copilot can help me out. So here, if we're mapping over text, we're gonna pass this, but then with config, let's see, let's make that text heading, right? So text heading, but then config text, right? And then for image, we're actually going to use a different component. We'll talk about that in a second, but just to stick to the logic here. And then a default, well, it will, let's actually return null. So here right now, we're just going to switch. Right, so now based on what's in the array, we're rendering this on the page. Right, so we have config heading now, but now we also need config text and config image. So here I defined config heading here in this file. It's a bit cleaner, I think, that we separate this into a separate file. Let's actually create a lib folder here, and let's call that configs.ts. I'm gonna pass this in that file, right? So here we have our config heading. I do need to import this from Froala editor, and I'm gonna export this. Okay, and then I need to remove it from here. And now we can import this from that file. Right now we can actually also remove this import. And yeah, so this is what we have right now. So we have this file here. Here we are doing that dynamic import for the plugin and the Froala component. Here we now have the static array that we're mapping over. And here we're passing the config for each type of content that we're gonna have for now. Right, so now we have one for heading. Now let's create config text. So let's do that here as well. Let's actually do that at the top. Config text. So it needs to have the same type. And this needs to be a constant. So let's see what we want to do here. So actually we want some of the same settings here. So let's actually copy these four, and initOnClick, yeah, that's all what we want. Now for placeholder text, we may just want to say something like your text ... So then we now have this config text. We need to make sure that we import that here. So now let's see what we get for the second editor in the array. Or config image is not defined. Let's quickly add that here as well, and then we'll just keep it empty for now. All right, so here I'm just defining it here, and then we're just gonna import that here. Okay, so now I have imported all of them. So let's focus on text here. Text is gonna be very similar as for the heading. So let's see what we get. And actually the image right now is kind of annoying. So let me just remove the image one from the array for now. So now we just have two, heading and text, right? So now we have heading and text. And you can see that text here actually has a different toolbar than what we have for heading. Because for heading, what we did here, let's see. For heading, we actually specified the buttons that we want. So these are actually going to be less. These are actually going to be fewer than by default, because here we haven't specified any buttons. And so if we look at the text right now, you can see you get much more. Also align center, right? So here, for example, this is a common one. You want to center it. Now that's also a plugin, and since we are importing all the plugins, they are also included. So we also have more paragraph style, bordered, right? You can do all sorts of things here. We can do undo here. And this one also has the character plugin here as well, character count. Now maybe we also don't want to have that character count here, so let's actually also remove it from here. And we probably also want to have a maximum and then let the user know if they hit the maximum. So we can just copy that. Here the maximum should probably be much more, maybe let's say 500. You have hit the limit for a text block. Right, so let's say something like this. Right, so now we have a very similar one as for the heading. We just have a slightly different toolbar. Now you can see the toolbar is quite wide. So can we maybe change the width of the toolbar? All right, so you can see that since we have more buttons here, this toolbar is actually quite wide compared to the other one. Here it was quite compact. Here it's very wide. So can we maybe change the width here? And actually, yeah, we can. So you need to do that after this has been initialized, right? So if we look here, this component first needs to be initialized, and that will actually be an event that we can hook into. So there is actually an initialized event. So when this is actually basically added to the page, we can do something here. So one of the things here, we get this keyword. Now this is the entire editor instance, but we just want to customize the toolbar here. So here you can also get access to the individual components or elements of that editor instance. So one of them is actually the toolbar. So if we do TB and we need to get the first element there, we can just set the style, right? So this will actually just give us the DOM node here. And then we can just set a maximum width here. So what we could say is maybe at most it should be 400 pixels wide. Right, so now if we try doing this, now you can see it's a bit more compact. I think this looks much better. All right, so some other things that you want to do commonly on a text input like this is maybe you want to do some validation. So maybe we want to check what the user wrote in there and we want to do something. So there is an event whenever the content changes. So content changed, so we can simply get access to whatever the user writes in here. So we can get the text. We can say this.html.get. All right, so here we have the text that the user wrote, but it's going to be in HTML format. So Froala here outputs HTML, right? So here, if we console log the text that we get here, right? So here, if we log the text that we get here when the content changes, let me actually inspect here, and let's go to console. Let me refresh here for a clean slate. I actually get an error here because of the key prop. Yeah, I will talk about that in a second. So now if I change something here in this text editor instance, you can see, first of all, it doesn't immediately output something to the console. That's for performance reasons, right? Because right, so Froala here doesn't trigger this event immediately after you do anything. It waits a little bit, although you can also customize that. Now here, what we eventually do get though, is you get the HTML. right? So here you can see the p tag here is included. Right, so if you really want to get that inner text, you need to do a little bit more pre-processing. So maybe you could do some kind of string replace the tags here. There are some solutions online. Right, so you have to understand that the output and input as well. We'll talk about that we'll talk more about that in a second. But basically, you can set what should be displayed with model, but that's going to be in that should be in HTML format again. Right, so it's important to understand that when you work with this component, what you put in, we'll talk about how you can set something there, and what you get out is always in HTML format. Right, so here maybe you can pre-process it a little bit further. Maybe you can do some validation, for example. But for now, I will remove this. All right, so one other thing I want to show you right now has to do with making these controlled components. Right, so right now we have two of these components on the page. Right, so let's take the heading here, for example. So here, if I type, well, this is all managed by Froala for us. Right, so just like in normal React, you have, right, so in React, we also have input elements, for example, and this is how this would work similarly. Now in React, you probably have seen that you can also make something a controlled element or a controlled component, which means that this component will not itself internally manage the data in here, but that we will specify it. So here with Froala, you do it with the model prop here. So here, whatever you pass here, right, so if I just say this is an example for the heading component, if I do that for the model, what do we see here? We see this is an example. So what you may want to do is make this a controlled component. So what you would have is you would put the model here in state. So here in Froala, this is called a model. I'm gonna import use state here. It's already a client component, so that should work. And now I can make this variable the model here. Right, so here now whatever is initial here, that's what we're gonna get here initially on the page, initial model. Now how do you update this? Well, here with Froala there is the on model change prop, and what you get there is the new model. So you get the new model, which is just a string of HTML actually. So we can actually log that. So new model, let me log that right here. So now if I save here and we right click here on initial model, if I just console log here, and now if I refresh for a clean slate, we still get the error from the key prop. We'll talk about it in a second. You can see that we get the HTML from inside that component, right? So this is the model here for the standard Froala component, right? So here what we can do here is instead of logging it, we want to set that to the new model, right? We want to update this. Now you have sort of like two-way data binding in React, right? So that's a controlled component. And actually what you can also do is just replace all of this with just a reference to the setModel function, right? So the benefit of doing this is that later we can now pass that model to some other component as well, as we'll see. For example, maybe you want to have like a preview mode, or maybe you want to send this to your backend, for example. Well, now it's very easy. You can just take the model and you want to save it somewhere, maybe local storage. You can use this. You can just use this. Right now, this is only for this particular component, but we're going to have other ones, right? So you would have maybe additional state for the other ones as well, right? But this is also a way of getting the HTML out of the component in case you need that, right? So you can use that event that we saw with content change, or there's also an input event, but you can also just use this on model change prop. It will give you the new model, right? So I will remove it for now. We will just leave this as an uncontrolled component. All right, so now we have a heading, we have text here. Now let's actually also implement this image here. So it's still going to be Froala editor component is what we have right now with tag is text area. And actually that's probably actually not what we want to do. So Froala actually also has some special components. So if you want to do an image, they have a special component for that. So here, this is also something we want to import dynamically, just like what we did with the other component. So here there is a, let's say, Froala editor image, and we will also make that dynamic. So you need to specify a function here, and we'll say don't server-side render this. And actually it's a one-liner, so we can just leave that off. And we can import from React Froala, what you see is what you get. And then there is a Froala editor image component. So I can save here, and then we can use this instead of the Froala editor component. So here, if I scroll down here, we are now using Froala editor component. I'm going to replace it with what we were just importing. All right, so then we also want to remove this tag is text area, and we are still passing config image. Let me see what we have for that. So if I just open this up, you can see currently that's just an empty object. All right, so let's actually see what we get. So now we actually don't see anything. So here, what we want to specify is actually some initial value. So here, just like before, we can specify the model. Now, previously for these two, the model is just going to be a string or an HTML string. Right now, for the image component, you actually want to specify an object. So for example, here, I'm going to specify an object and I can specify a source. This is going to be the initial image. And there's actually a website that will give you some placeholder images. And I can give this some alternative text. I can give this an alt, even a title, a width. If I do this, we actually still don't see anything because we actually removed it from our array here. So if I scroll up here, yeah, we removed it from our array. That doesn't matter because we needed to add that model anyway. So if I save here now, you can see we now have this placeholder image. And if you click it, you can see because we're now using that Froala we're now using the Froala image component. It has this default behavior out of the box. So you get a nice way of resizing. We can make it the full width if we want. Now, of course, we don't want to have this image. We want to replace this with our own image. So the user can click here and upload it from their own computer. They can even use something like Unsplash or so, just use a URL. And Froala actually also comes with some built-in images. So maybe we want this hot air balloon. I can click on this one and you actually get a nice image here out of the box. All right, and we get all of these options aligned. Maybe I want to put it in the center. Image caption, so you can specify caption here if you want. I'm going to remove that. All right, so a very powerful component as well. Okay, so now we've seen heading text, right? So heading and text have the same basic Froala editor component. We have seen an image component. Now Froala also has a button component. So let me also show you that. So here, let's add another one to the array. Let's say we also have a button content block. So then here, where we map over those content blocks here after image, we also want one for a button. And let's just add this for now. But what we're going to import here is actually a bit different. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to have a Froala editor button component. Also dynamic. And this is what we're going to import. Okay, and then we can use that as the component here for the button. Right, so here I want to remove the tag. We don't want the text area. We actually want a button tag in the HTML. Right, so now if I save here, all right, so now we have this. Let's actually change this to config button. Now here for this, we don't have it yet. And we don't have one yet. Let's quickly add one for the button as well. We haven't specified any additional options for the image yet. We will talk about that later, although there's not many options that we want to pass. All right, so here we have config button. I will also leave that empty for now. Okay, so let me just import this. Okay, so now we won't see anything yet because here we also want to pass some initial options or some initial data here. So for the button component, we also have an object as the model. And here we want to specify the inner HTML. This is going to be the text inside the button. So if we do this, you can see we now have this button here. I can click it and it will actually open up this dialog here where I can change the text and it will change it, right? Now, how do you style this, right? So if I right click here, you can see that it actually inserts a button tag in the HTML, right? So previously what we were doing here is with the base component, we have a paragraph here. With the image, we actually have an image tag. And then here with the button, we actually get a button tag. Now, if we want to style this, we can actually just set the style, right? So these are going to be the attributes on the underlying button tag in the HTML. So that's what you specify here in these models, right? Same for the image. These are just going to be the attributes that you're going to get on the underlying image that's going to be rendered in the HTML. So here for the button, we can just set the style, right? So if we quickly want to style that, this is now what we get for the button, right? So here we can just change that. All right, so then let's move on to a link. Let me also quickly show you that. So here, let's go to our array here where we're mapping over them. Let's also add a link. So here, I'm just going to copy the button. So for a link, we actually want to render an anchor tag on the page. So there is also a component from Froala for that. Let me also import that here. So we're going to have const FroalaEditor, and it's just A. All right, so now we have this FroalaEditor A for anchor tag. So now I'm going to add that right here. All right, so here for case link. So I will remove the style here, and then for the inner HTML, it's going to be this. It's going to be the same as for, right? So here the model is going to be similar as to the button. So here for the inner HTML, we could say the link text. All right, so if I save here and go back, we now have this link here. If you click it, there will be the toolbar from Froala. I can open the link. I can style this, although we haven't specified any styles yet for the link. And then we have this edit link. Now, this is not working properly yet because we need to specify some more information here for Froala. So here we have config button. Let's now make this config link. These are the options that we pass to the component. So if we go here, let's also add one for the link. And now actually we will specify some options that we need to specify if we want to make this work properly. So I will quickly import this here as well. Okay. So now what we can pass here is, for example, a way to style the links. So right now, if you click here, so right now, if I open this up, you can see style. Well, by default, it has these green and thick styles. Right, so then we have this link on the page. Right, so let me refresh actually here for clean slate. So if you open this up, by default, you're gonna get this this toolbar here. So we're gonna have an open link if we want to open it up in our own browser. We also have two options here for styling, but by default they have this green and thick styles. And we can also change the text here. So link text, just a link. Now this will only work, changing the text, if you also specify a URL, otherwise it will not update in my experience. We can click this to open it up in a new tab. And now we have changed our link here. Right, so that's how we can add a link. All right, so here all right, so let's take a look at how we can change the styles of a link. So let me remove this. So these are the green and thick are the two default ones. All right, so if we want to change the styles of a link, we have the link styles option. And so we can specify our own CSS classes. So let's say we're going to have two styles. We're going to give them a name. So let's say a Froala link 1, and then the description of that style, we can call that link style 1. And then we'll have another class. These need to be the classes in the CSS. So here, then we have these two. So whatever you pass here as a key, that needs to be a CSS class name. So now I want to open up my CSS. So let's see here in app, I can go to globals.css, and I'm using Tailwind here. So what we want to do is we want to create a class with this name. So here we can say Froala link 1. Now I'm using now I can use this, of course, to just plain CSS. But let's say we want to use Tailwind here. Well, Tailwind allows you to do this here as well with using apply. So let's actually use that. So I want to give this an underline, a color, and let's also make this a block level component so that it actually takes up its own line. And then we also have the other one, Froala link 2. And here, let's just make that, I don't know, text green 800 and also block. Right, so this is just a way of adding of applying Tailwind CSS styles. But this would work the exact same with just plain CSS declarations, right? So it doesn't matter if you use apply or not. Right, so now we have specified that these two classes, well, these are the two link styles. So now let me just refresh here for a clean slate. So now if I open these up, so now if I click here and open this up, we have style, and we get link style 1 and link style 2. If I click on link style 1, you can see we get this style here from our CSS, right? So that's what we are applying, right? So this is how you can apply the styles for a link. If I click on the other one, it will actually also apply the other one. So by default, you can apply multiple ones. You can disable that here as an option, but I will leave it like this. Right, so here what you can also do is link multiple styles. This should be false if you only want to allow one link style at a time. And there are many other options we can pass here. So we have link edit buttons, but also things like link no referrer, link auto prefix. So if you want to automatically add HTTPS, actually that's a good idea probably. Right, so many options we can pass here for a link as well. All right, so I also quickly want to show you how you can add a code block here. So right, maybe the user should be able to write in code and then it should be reflected here like how it actually would look like. So let's go back to our editing area here. Let's see. So here, let's also add one for code. Okay, and then here at the bottom, let's say case code. So for a code block, we can actually just use the basic editor component. I will remove the tag here. And here we have config code. So here, let's go here and I will just copy one of these, config code. Okay, all right, let me import this. Okay, so we're just using the basic component. And if we look right now, we just see our basic component, right? It's not, right? So here we haven't specified any options. So this is like the default view that you're gonna get. So here for this one, we wanna only enable 2 plugins here actually. So it's gonna be code view as it's called. So that's how you turn the normal basic component into a code view. And then there's also code beautifier. So we can enable these 2 plugins. Remember, we're importing all plugins. Right, so here I'm importing all of them. So these should be available. And now what we can also add is toolbar buttons. So the only thing that we want to see is actually the HTML button to switch between the code view and the HTML. So here you can see we now have this code view. So here right now it's not in the code view, but if I click on this now, you can see there is code here. Now actually by default we're going to get some divs here. I think it's just how we added that here. Of course I can just remove this, and now I want to be able to write an h1 here. Let me zoom in a little bit. I have h1 here, test. Right, so here I now have an h1. Now if I go back, it should become an h1 here on the page. Right, so this also should be inline the toolbar. So here what we can say is, now here to actually make this work, instead of saying toolbar should be inline, what we're actually going to do is here, if you are in the code view and now go back, the editor will actually just be destroyed so that we actually only see this h1 here in the actual editing area. So let me show you what I mean. So here, events, we can hook into that switching event. So when the user goes back to the normal view, there is a code view.update. And here, we don't want to do this. We want to say this.destroy. So let's actually see what we get if we do that. So let me refresh here for a clean slate. Okay, so now we have the standard view. Now if I go into code view, and let's actually say test here for h1. Now if I go back, the editor should be destroyed. So you can see the editor is now destroyed and we just are left with this test here. If I inspect here, we see h1 here. So it actually did insert that HTML here into the overall HTML here. And let's actually make sure that these h1s are actually styled like an h1, right? Because right now we don't have any styling for an h1. So to do that, we just need to go to our CSS, and here we can just style all h1s on the page. We can use some tailwind here. Let's make it 3XL and also font bold. All right, so if we save here, you will see that that h1 now is actually styled like a heading. Now here for our previously a heading, if we have test here, what we have to do here, we will have to manually increase the font size and make it bold. So we can do it manually, but if you're inserting a heading, you kind of already expect this text to be bigger. So what we could do here is for the heading here as well. So here heading, what you can also just do is you can wrap it in a div. Right, so here you can just put this in a div and you can just give it a class name of heading, let's say. So if you do that, and then we can just style the same way, right? So in CSS, you can use the comma, and then we can just also target elements with a class of heading. And then the text here that we would have to, that we insert will be a child element of this, right? So it will inherit these styles. So now if I go back here, you can see that this heading, if I refresh, your heading here is also quite big now, right? So I think that makes more sense, right? So here, if we go into code view and we now write h1 cool, right? So now the user is able to paste, let's say, some HTML snippet into here, and now they should be able to go back here and it should just be added to the page. That's what we want here, right? So now the user can just add code like that. All right, now what we want for the code component is that we don't have to click to code view. It should automatically start at the code view essentially, right? So here it starts at a normal view and then we have to click to see code view. So with Froala, again, pretty much everything you can do. So with Froala, again, pretty much everything you can do here with this can also be done. So here when this component is initialized, right, so there is an initialize event, then we can check if the code view is already active. So initially it's going to be false, right? So here if is active. So if that's not the case, so if we don't have code view yet, right? So initially we don't have code view, then we're going to toggle that, right? So I will do optional chaining here because could be undefined, and this here as well. And actually the event is called initialized. Now make sure that you don't make that mistake. So now you can see when I refresh here and that code component is initialized, we get the code view by default. And so then we can just add whatever we want here. And then it will be added here to the page. Right, so we'll make all of this work in a second when you actually click on it, that it actually inserts it. I just quickly want to give an overview of all the components here, or all the content blocks here. Let's continue with the markdown here. That's the last one. So here I will just add markdown. And here we'll have case markdown. We're also just going to use the basic Froala component, config markdown. Okay, so then we can go here and let's just copy this one. All right, so for this one, to make it work with the rest, so plugins enabled just means which plugins you want to enable for this component, because we are importing all of the plugins by default for the page, but maybe for some of these instances we don't need all of them. Right, so here we only need markdown, right? And then here for toolbar buttons we actually don't want any. So you can actually also create an empty, you can also just add an empty array. If we do this and I have config code here, should be config markdown. So now still need to import this. Okay, now if we go back, all right, so now we have this code here, and then below there, we're gonna have the markdown. To make this work, we need to do something similar as what we did for the code component here. So I'm just gonna copy this initialized event. Actually, let me copy all of this. And I will just remove the code view update. So for initialized, so here we wanna check if the markdown exists. So if this.markdown, and then if it's not enabled yet, so here it's called is enabled, then we want to toggle that. So immediately when it's initialized, we should see the markdown view essentially. So let's check it out. So now if I refresh here, we see our code component, and below there, we see our markdown component, right? So here I can write text in asterisks, and indeed we get this bold text, right? That's how markdown works. Right, so here some heading and then smaller heading. Yeah, so markdown here also works. This is also something you can do with Froala. All right, so all of this is taking up quite some space here, so let me zoom out a little bit. So this is what we have right now. This is the overall UI. We have now seen an example of all of these content blocks. We've configured them. So now, of course, we want to make it work so that the user can actually click on that. So let's see how we can do that. All right, now before we actually make all of this work, we still have that issue with the key error, right? So here, if I go to the console, we have this warning, each child in a list should have a unique key prop, right? So here, typically you use map, right? So React uses the key prop to keep track of the components between them. So you need to make sure this is unique, so that over time, as you re-render, and maybe you're changing the order, let's say, And actually for our use case, that's important because, well, you can imagine that we can switch around these content blocks. So here it's actually important that you specify a unique key so that React internally can keep track of which one is which, right? So here it's a bit difficult because we map over these blocks and we just have their text. But we can have multiple text blocks and we can have multiple images, etc. So just the text alone is not unique enough. So here what we may want to do is just turn this into objects. So instead of having the string heading, we may want to have an object with a name, and that's for heading, but then also an ID, let's say. So here we could have an ID, and maybe we can randomly generate this. And let's actually do this with the date. So we'll just, random number is technically, of course, not always going to be unique. So there are ways to make that better, but just as an example here, we can do it for all of them. Yeah, so I will just accept this from Copilot and I will remove this. Right, so now all of them, they have an ID. And now what we can do is here, for example, whatever you return, you need to do it on that return on the outer element here. So here we need to specify block.id. And we have an issue here because we have an issue here from TypeScript. So block ID does not exist on type never. So here it's because we're switching over block. But block is an object now. So what are we checking specifically? Well, we're checking for the block name, right? So here we do need to change that as well. So then we can just add this key to all of these. Okay, so that's the last one. Okay, so now we have gotten rid of that error. If I inspect, we don't have an error anymore. All right, so here right now we have our content blocks, and it's always this array that we're mapping over. So it's always that static array. So here we always see this specific array every time. But of course it should be dynamic. It should be based on what we click here. So initially it should be empty, right? So what we want to do here is, right, so here is right now always this array with all of these objects. It's always the same static array. Now, if we click on, let's say, any of these, we should be able to add something here, and then it should re-render. Now, what we want is when you click on any of these buttons, it should add something to the array, and then it should re-render with that new array, right? So that's a good use case for the useState hook in React. Now, where are we going to put that? Because here, the editing area and toolbar, this is where we should click, right? So here we click on the button and it should add something to that array, right? So here we could do some prop drilling. So here, the toolbar and the editing area are in the home page. We could lift the state up here and then do some prop drilling, right? We can also put it in a context API or toStand or Redux, whatever your state management, whatever solution you want to use for state management. Now for simplicity, I'm actually just going to add it here because it's just a simple demo app. I don't want to create a whole bunch of boilerplate. This is not typically what I would do. Of course, in the real world, I would use a state management solution. Or just use the context API. Now here, what we're going to do is I'm going to add the content blocks one level up here. I'm going to remove it from here. I'm going to add it right here. And so here we have our content blocks. Initially, it should be empty actually. So it should just be an empty array, right? And so let's actually create some state out of this. So we will have content blocks, use state. It should just be an empty array initially. So let me import that. Right, and then we can just pass down the content blocks to the editing area. Right, so here we will just accept the content blocks. I will deal with TypeScript in a second. So here we now pass down. Now here from toolbar, we need a way to update it. So here, let me just quickly pass it down to toolbar. All right, now actually we could pass it like this, but actually a cleaner way is to specify the ways to update the state close to where the state actually is. So here we can actually create a handler function. So handle add block. So what we want to be able to do, is the new block name, right? So we just have to call the function with the name of the block, like heading or whatever, heading or text or code. And here we can then create the actual object, right? So remember, they need to have an ID. So I'm getting some suggestion here from Copilot. Let's just do math random. So the name is going to be this, and that's what we're going to add to that array. So we haven't typed this for TypeScript yet. So we get an issue here with TypeScript. So I'm just going to ignore that for now, this as well. And now we can just pass down this function, right? So we just need to pass down the function. The toolbar doesn't need to know about the inner details of how to do that. So here then we can just call that function when we click on the button. And then we just need to pass the name of the tool, right? So here we just have heading, text, image. That's what we're going to pass there. Let's see if we have any issues. Yeah, so here now because I'm using a state here on the page, I need to turn the entire page into a client component. This is typically not recommended, right? Turning your whole page, including everything that you're importing, into a client component. This is not recommended typically, but here in this simple demo app, I will just do that. All right, so now if we go here, we have an empty editing area initially, because initially it's just an empty array, right? And then when you click on any of these tools, it should call that handle add block function, which will actually add something to the array, cause a re-render. And so the new content blocks passed to the editing area should reflect that. Now if I click on heading, let's see what we get. And indeed, we see a your heading block on the page. And again, we can edit this just like before. Right, so let's actually do that. Book a hot air balloon. Let's say we're creating a page about booking hot air balloons. Okay, and then I want to add an image below there. All right, so now we get an image, and I want to replace this. Let's see, we want to have this, right? I can make this big or small. Okay, I'm actually going to put this in the center. And I actually also want to be able to put the heading in the center. So let's quickly configure that. Let's go to the heading config at the bottom here. I want to have one for align as well. Yeah, align. All right, so then here I can now align this in the center. All right, and then maybe below here we want to have some text. All right, so we have text here. Also want to center that. Only available on sunny days. All right, maybe we want to make that a little bit bigger, or all right, maybe we want to make that stand out a little bit with the border. Okay, and we can add other things here, right? So we can add a link here. We've seen that. We can use one of those styles that we added, so link style, and then we can change the text here, maybe to contact us, and then maybe the URL to our contact page. I'm going to update it. Right, so that's a link. We can add a button here that would do something similar, or maybe the user can copy paste their HTML from somewhere else and it will just be reflected here. Right, so we can also do that. So instead of using our buttons here, the user maybe already has some HTML. They can just paste that right here. Right, so here they can just paste it, and then it will immediately be added here as well. Right, so now we have pretty much built a basic page builder, and it's basically just a bunch of content blocks, right, an array of them. And that's basically how it works. Now you can make it much more sophisticated. You can work with columns, right, and rows. We just basically have one column right now, and everything just takes up one line. Now we may also want to add a way to remove these blocks from the page. So here we have an event handler for adding a block, but maybe we also have one for removing a block. So Copilot should be able to guess this pretty well. All right, so here we get a way to remove one. We just have to pass in the ID of the content block that we want to remove. All right, so here in components, I will create a component for that, delete button.tsx, and I'm just going to paste it right here. So it just needs to get that on delete function. So let's see where to add that. So we could add it for all of them here. So here, for example, next to it, we can have that delete button. So let me import that. So on delete, we want to run that handle remove block. So let's see, we need to pass that here then to editing area. Right, and then we can accept that right here. And then we can paste it right here. Right, and we just have to pass the ID. So that's block.id. Okay, so then this is for the heading. So now if we have a heading, all right, so we also need to style that. So we need to add some styles for that. Let's see. So let me add that at the bottom here. So here we have delete button. It's going to be hidden initially, but we're going to show this on hover, right? So we do need to add this content block class as well. So here, well, we have heading here, but it's also a content block. So maybe you want to add it right there. So now you can see when I hover this, there is a delete button. When I click it, it gets removed, right? We're only doing this for the heading right now, but we can do this for any other content block that we add as well. And it works the exact same. All right, so last thing I want to show you has to do with, let's say, a preview button. So there is also a preview component that Froala gives you. So for example, we have all of these components. Now there's one more, and it's actually a FroalaEditorView component. So dynamic, and this is indeed how we should import that. Okay, so this is how I'm importing that here. So this is what we can use to take the model, right? So here, what we can do is make this a controlled component again, and then you can take that model and pass it to that view component. So let's quickly just give you an example for the heading here. So if I do model here for the heading, right? So here for the basic component, it's just going to be a string, right? So model here is just a string, right? So here I'm going to make it a on model change, I'm going to make it a controlled component, right? So here's set model, right? So this is what we have now, right? So then here, if I go back, if I add a heading, we're going to see initial model here. Right? So now the content here is driven by state. Right? So now the content of this component is driven by our state here. Okay, and let's actually add back the character counter. So let's go back to our configs. So for the heading, let's see, we have character counter is false. Let's actually set it back to true again. So if I save here, and let's actually also make the toolbar false for inline, so we actually see the complete UI there. Now let me refresh here, and let me also comment out all of that actually. So I'm going to commit this out as well. And now if I refresh, let's actually add a heading here. We see this basic UI that you get, right? So here now I can type, right, hello world. Maybe you have your component like this. But now, of course, you may also want to have a situation where you can sort of show the output to the user somewhere else or without all of this UI. So that's what you have this component for. So here, let's see, we have the FroalaEditorView component. So here I can also add that here. And here I can pass that model, right? So here we have the actual editor component. This one is just for viewing whatever is the model. So here I just passed the model to there. And now when I go back, you can see we actually see our view right here. Right, so maybe we have some kind of preview button. Right, so maybe we have some other state for determining if we're in the preview mode. So here determining depending on if we're in preview mode. If we're in preview mode, we just want to get that editor, the view here. And otherwise, we want to have this. Right, so in preview mode, we're just going to have the editor view, and otherwise we're going to have our standard component. So now we have our standard component. Let me make this a little bit smaller. But if we flip this to true, save here, you would just see this. Right, so we could have a preview mode, and you can use the editor view component to just show the model. Right, so now we have a simple page builder, and you can see how straightforward it is to create it with Froala. Right, so it's a really powerful, what you see is what you get HTML editor. So I want to thank Froala for sponsoring this video. Check it out, the link is in the description. And I hope that this video helped you out with how to use it. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.